Going back to Nancy Guthrie, and I know, look, that's not your expertise by any means, but I just want to look back at what I was able to report and get the wording right. But basically, the person who wrote the note said, buried with nature now, which made me think, if the note is true, buried in the ground. But I guess that may not be the case based on what you're, I mean, maybe it would have been very difficult to bury someone.
Yeah, yeah. Typically, unless they've put a body in Arizona somewhere very disturbed, because like my yard, would have been dug up for the pool and, soils brought in and so forth. I would really think that would be a misnomer, because it's really very, very difficult to dig in this type of soil.
The second ransom note said she was dead, not missing, not hidden, dead, and buried with nature somewhere out in the vast, scorching expanse of the Sonoran Desert, surrounding Tucson, Arizona. Those 4 words, buried with nature, changed everything about this investigation, because the desert is not just a location. It is a force. It swallows things whole. It erases footprints, bleaches bones, scatters evidence across thousands of square miles of terrain so brutal, so unforgiving, that even experienced search teams have walked directly over remains without ever knowing they were there. Whoever wrote that note understood exactly what they were saying. They understood that the Arizona desert is one of the most effective places on Earth to make something disappear, and for a long time science seemed to agree with them. But science changed its mind. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and join the community over at Keith's Crime Files, because what we're about to get into is the kind of information that most true crime channels never go near, the forensic science that could determine whether Nancy Guthrie is ever found, and whether whoever is responsible for her disappearance ever faces justice. Nancy Guthrie vanished in Arizona, and from the beginning the desert played a central role in how this case unfolded. 2 ransom notes were sent during the investigation. The first created urgency. The second delivered devastation. That second note stated plainly that Nancy was dead, and that she had been buried with nature, a phrase that law enforcement, forensic specialists, and investigators following this case have been dissecting ever since. Because here is what that phrase implies on a practical level. It implies someone made a decision about where to put a body in one of the most extreme environments in the continental United States. And that decision, whatever it was, may have been far less clean than the person who wrote those words intended. The Sonoran Desert surrounding Tucson reaches temperatures well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during summer months. Humidity drops to levels that accelerate mummification rather than decomposition in the traditional sense. Rain is scarce for stretches so long that the ground bakes into a surface almost indistinguishable from stone. And beneath that surface, just inches beneath it in many areas, lies a geological layer called caliche, a calcium carbonate hardpan so dense and so impenetrable that it has been compared, by people who have tried to dig through it, to breaking through concrete with bare hands. This is the first thing that changes the entire framework of how we think about the phrase buried with nature. Forensic anthropologists who have worked in the Arizona desert have documented a pattern that appears repeatedly in cases involving body disposal. A person arrives with the intention of digging. They begin, and within inches they hit caliche. The digging stops. The plan changes, and instead of a grave, the body is left on the surface, exposed to sun, wind, scavengers, and time, because the desert itself made burial impossible. That distinction matters enormously. A body left on the surface of the desert decomposes, moves, and scatters differently than a buried body. It becomes subject to the full weight of that environment. Coyotes, vultures, beetles, and other scavengers can scatter skeletal remains across a radius far greater than the original deposition site within weeks. Summer monsoon rains can displace lighter materials. Wind does the rest. From a purely logistical standpoint, finding someone in the Arizona desert, even knowing they are out there, is an extraordinary challenge for law enforcement. The terrain is vast, the access roads are limited, and the conditions actively work against recovery efforts. This is not speculation. This is the documented reality of desert search operations, confirmed by forensic professionals who work in this environment. But here is where the story takes a turn that almost no one saw coming. Researchers at Arizona State University have been conducting a study that directly confronts the assumption that the desert erases all evidence of a body's presence. The research, which grew out of a collaboration between faculty members in forensic science and interdisciplinary sciences, used pig carcasses dressed in human clothing, a standard scientific model in forensic research, to simulate the conditions of outdoor body deposition in the desert environment north of Phoenix. 2 clothed pig carcasses were placed in the desert, one positioned beneath a mesquite tree in partial shade, one placed in direct, unobstructed sunlight. They remained in those positions for approximately 5 weeks during the late spring season, before being relocated to secondary sites as part of a broader decomposition study being conducted by forensic anthropologist Dr. Caitlin Bohlhoffner. After 5 weeks in the Arizona desert, those carcasses were described as heavily mummified, dried, leathery, desiccated by the heat and the absence of moisture. Still identifiable, clothing still intact. The desert had not destroyed them. It had preserved them, in its own brutal way, by removing almost all of their moisture before traditional decomposition could fully progress. But the carcasses were gone from the original sites, moved, relocated, and the question that followed was the one that changed everything. After more than a year had passed, after a full Arizona summer, a dry fall, a winter, and another spring had cycled through that original deposition site, was there anything left in the soil to indicate a body had ever been there? The working assumption, even among the scientists conducting the research, was no. The desert is too harsh. The conditions too extreme. A year of intense UV radiation, near-zero precipitation, and baking heat would sterilize any biological trace left behind. That assumption was wrong. When an undergraduate forensic science student returned to the original deposition sites and collected soil samples, the analysis revealed something that the lead researcher described as nearly knocking her out of her chair. The soil from directly beneath, where the pig carcasses had rested, for only 5 weeks, was statistically significantly different from the surrounding desert soil where no body had ever been placed. Not just slightly different, measurably, reproducibly, scientifically provably different. The difference was not the pig's own DNA. It was something more persistent and more complex. It was the bacterial microbiome, the community of microorganisms produced and altered by the process of decomposition itself. As a body breaks down, it leaves behind a biological signature in the soil, a specific collection of bacteria, a distinct microbial fingerprint that reflects the chemistry of decomposition. That fingerprint, in the Arizona desert, survived more than a year of the most extreme conditions that environment could produce. The research also extended into elemental analysis, examining the chemical composition of the soil itself, carbon levels, nitrogen content, other elemental markers. And those, too, were statistically different in the soil that had been beneath the body compared to undisturbed desert soil nearby. What this means, applied directly to a real investigation, is this. If a body was placed somewhere in the desert and later moved, whether after days, weeks, or potentially months, the original deposition site would still carry a detectable signature. Investigators who knew where to look, who could collect soil samples and run them through DNA extraction and microbial sequencing, could potentially establish that a body had been there, even without the body, even a year or more after the fact. The desert does not forget, and the researchers did not stop at 1 year. They returned to the original sites again, after a total of more than 2.5 years had passed. What they found at that point is something we will cover in the second part of this breakdown, because the implications of those results reach directly into what law enforcement is facing in the Nancy Guthrie investigation and what may still be recoverable from whatever location Nancy was left. The phrase "buried with nature" was meant to signal finality. It was meant to communicate that the desert had done its work, that evidence had been erased, and that Nancy Guthrie was gone beyond the reach of any investigation. What the science is now telling us is that the desert may be the best witness this case has. #Nancy Guthrie investigation. The traces bodies leave behind in the desert. #Keith's crime files. 2.5 years. That is how long the research team waited before returning to those original deposition sites a second time. And what they found when they got there did not just surprise them. It separated the science into two completely different stories, one for each pig, and in doing so, revealed something about the Arizona desert that no investigator working a body recovery case in this landscape can afford to ignore. The pig that had been placed beneath the mesquite tree, the one resting in partial shade for those 5 weeks, had left a microbial signature that, by the 2.5-year mark, had vanished. The soil beneath that tree was no longer statistically distinguishable from the surrounding undisturbed desert ground. Whatever biological record the decomposition had written into that earth had been erased. The signature was gone, but the pig placed in direct sunlight told an entirely different story. That soil, the patch of open desert ground that absorbed the full, unrelenting exposure of the Arizona sun, still carried a statistically significant microbial difference from every control sample taken around it. More than 2 years after the body had been removed. More than 2 years of seasonal cycling, monsoon rains, and brutal summer heat pressing down on that exact spot. The forensic fingerprint was still there, still measurable, still scientifically distinct from the earth beside it. The explanation researchers arrived at has almost nothing to do with sunlight itself. It has everything to do with the tree. A mesquite tree is not a passive object sitting in the desert. It is a continuously active biological system. It drops leaves. It draws insects. It provides shade that attracts animals seeking relief from the heat. It sustains its own dense and varied microbial community in the soil beneath its canopy, a community that is far more populated, far more diverse, and far more dynamic than the relatively sparse microbial life found in open, exposed desert ground. When a decomposing body is placed beneath that tree, the biological signature it leaves in the soil does not exist in isolation. It enters a competing environment, and over 2.5 years, the existing microbial activity beneath that mesquite canopy gradually overwhelmed the decomposition signature, diluted it, and eventually absorbed it back into the background noise of the tree's own ecosystem. The open desert has no such competing noise. The microbial community in unshaded, undisturbed desert soil is sparse. When decomposition introduces a new and chemically distinct bacterial population into that environment, there is nothing to compete with it, nothing to dilute it, and nothing to write over it. It simply persists, held in place by the very biological emptiness of the ground around it. That distinction, shaded versus unshaded, biologically active ground versus biologically sparse ground, is now a forensic variable. It is a factor that investigators and forensic scientists working desert recovery cases need to account for when determining both where to look and how much time may have passed before the soil evidence becomes unrecoverable. The desert is not a uniform environment. Its capacity to preserve or erase evidence shifts depending on what is growing in it, what is living beneath it, and what the canopy above a given spot allows to reach the ground. And the soil is only one layer of what investigators may be working with. Something emerged from this research that extends the forensic picture well beyond microbial signatures and elemental chemistry. Something that had not been a primary focus of the original study, but surfaced as a finding significant enough to reshape how forensic scientists think about clothing in outdoor deposition cases. Synthetic fibers decompose, not quickly and not visibly, but they break down under prolonged environmental exposure, and as they do, they release chemicals and elements directly into the soil beneath them. The specific chemical trace depends on the specific fiber. Different synthetic materials produce different breakdown compounds, but the principle holds across fabric types. A person left in the desert, while wearing clothing made of synthetic materials, would leave not just a biological signature in the soil, but a chemical one tied specifically to what they were wearing. This matters in a way that goes beyond simple confirmation that a body was present. It introduces the possibility of material specificity. If investigators know what a missing person was wearing at the time of their disappearance, and in many cases family members, surveillance footage, or witness, accounts establish exactly that. Then the soil at a suspected deposition site could be tested for the chemical breakdown compounds of those specific materials. A match would not just confirm human presence. It would connect that specific individual to that specific location through the chemistry of their own clothing. 3 independent forensic channels now exist in that soil. The microbial community altered by decomposition, the elemental composition shifted by biological chemistry, and the chemical residue of fabric breakdown from whatever the person was wearing. Each one operates on its own timeline. Each one persists through different conditions and for different durations, and each one can be pursued independently, meaning that even if one channel has degraded past the point of reliable detection, the others may still be intact and readable. The critical and non-negotiable requirement for all of it is that investigators must know what they are looking for before the analysis begins. This is not a limitation of the science. It is simply how the science works, and it is the opposite of how forensic investigation is typically portrayed in popular media. There is no instrument that receives an uncharacterized soil sample and produces a comprehensive answer. The analysis requires a specific question. Investigators must arrive at the site already knowing whether they are searching for microbial signatures, elemental shifts, or fiber breakdown compounds, and ideally all 3, because the soil will only yield information about what it is specifically asked to reveal. The instrumentation required for elemental analysis, X-ray fluorescence equipment, currently carries a price point in the range of $250,000 for a standard research-grade machine. That is not an obstacle unique to this type of investigation. It is the ordinary cost of forensic instrumentation at this level of sensitivity. Law enforcement agencies that do not own this equipment outright have pathways to it through laboratory collaboration, university partnerships, and private forensic service providers. The methodology itself is established, reproducible, and not experimental. The ASU team conducted their elemental analysis in-house. The capacity exists. What cannot be improvised is the expertise to interpret what the results mean. A soil sample showing elevated nitrogen, a shifted elemental ratio, or a statistically distinct microbial community is not self-explanatory. It requires someone who understands the existing body of literature, who knows what other studies have found, what baseline desert soil composition looks like, what decomposition-associated changes are expected to look like, and what a result means when it either confirms or departs from those expectations. The instrument generates data. The expert gives that data meaning. This is precisely the kind of expertise that exists at Arizona State University, and precisely the kind of scientific collaboration that could theoretically be extended to an active law enforcement investigation. The research team is currently in the middle of a funded replication study, expanded in scale, more rigorous in design, with multiple time points, more subjects, and a dedicated statistician conducting time series analysis to map exactly how long each type of soil signature persists under Arizona desert conditions. That study is not theoretical. The subjects are already in the field. The data collection has begun. When that expanded dataset is complete, investigators will have something they do not currently have: a validated, statistically robust timeline for how long microbial, elemental, and potentially fiber-derived signatures persist in Arizona desert soil under documented conditions. That timeline will tell a law enforcement agency not just whether evidence is likely to still be present at a suspected site, but how confident they can be in that likelihood based on how much time has elapsed since the suspected deposition. There is also a question that this research raises about the difference between animal and human remains, because the pig model, for all its utility, is still a model. It is an approximation. Research conducted at body donation facilities in other states has examined the differences between human and animal decomposition signatures in soil, and those differences are detectable. The microbial communities associated with human decomposition are not identical to those produced by pig decomposition. They are similar enough to make the pig model a valid and widely accepted scientific proxy, but the distinction exists and is measurable. For an investigator seeking to confirm not just that biological material was present at a location, but that the material was specifically human, that distinction becomes operationally significant. The forensic capacity to make that determination exists. It requires the same DNA extraction and sequencing methodology used to identify microbial communities generally, applied with the specific goal of distinguishing human-associated bacterial signatures from those associated with other animals. That analysis is possible. It adds another layer of specificity to what the soil can reveal. One additional variable shapes everything about how this science applies to any specific scenario in the Arizona desert: time. Not the time elapsed since the body was removed, but the time the body was present at the original location before being moved or scattered. The depth and persistence of the soil signature is directly proportional to the duration of the body's presence. A body that remained at a site for several weeks under active decomposition conditions left the kind of signature the ASU team detected more than 2 years later. A body present for a shorter period would leave a lighter trace. A body present for longer would theoretically leave a more deeply embedded one. The stage of decomposition during that window also determines how much biological material entered the soil. Active decomposition, the phase before desiccation arrests biological breakdown, is when the greatest volume of decomposition fluid moves downward into the ground. In the Arizona desert, extreme heat and near-zero humidity can compress the active decomposition window significantly, accelerating the transition to mummification faster than in any humid environment where body farm research has historically been conducted. That compression means the window of maximum soil contamination may be shorter in Arizona than elsewhere. But the research shows clearly that even a compressed active decomposition phase, over 5 weeks in late spring conditions north of Phoenix, was sufficient to leave a signature detectable more than 2 years later in open, unshaded terrain. Arizona holds a weight in this conversation that no amount of scientific abstraction can fully capture. The missing persons landscape in this state is staggering in its scale. Deputies working the terrain around Tucson have described the experience of searching the desert as an encounter with accumulated absence, the sense that the land holds far more than it has ever given back. There is a designated event, Missing in Arizona Day, that gathers the families of the missing alongside forensic professionals in a unified effort to share information and resources across cases that might otherwise remain permanently siloed from one another. Nancy Guthrie's case exists within that larger landscape. It is one story within a pattern that the Arizona desert has been accumulating for decades. But it is also a case with specific, documented evidence: ransom notes, a stated claim of death, a phrase that pointed investigators toward the desert. That gives forensic science a defined context in which to operate. The ground in that desert is not empty. It is a record, invisible to the eye, inaccessible without the right instruments and the right questions, but present, persistent. patient in a way that no human investigation can fully match. The science now knows how to ask. The desert has been answering all along. If you want to be here for every update on the Nancy Guthrie case and every piece of forensic science that connects to what happened out in that desert, subscribe to Keith's Crime Files right now and hit the like button on this video. This investigation is not over, and neither is our coverage of it.